Hi, everyone. This is V-Shake from ShakeTheCosmos.com. My guest today is Yi Chen. She's a documentary filmmaker based in Washington, D.C., and her work explores the intersection of racial justice, immigration, and democracy. She directed and produced First Vote. I just recently watched this documentary. Go check it out, firstvote.com. And we're going to talk about the background, context, the impetus behind this documentary, and then also the diverse set of subjects she had in the documentary, and dive into some of the themes. And if you're listening right now, hit the follow or subscribe button. And if you like this episode, give it a 5-star rating. That helps me in the organic search results. Thank you so much for being on the show. You really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, so can you just give a little bit background about you for the listeners who are listening right now?
Sure. So like you said, I'm a filmmaker based in Washington, D.C. I was born and grew up in Shanghai, and I came to the United States in 2003 to attend graduate school. And I got my MFA from American University's film program. I have worked since in journalism and nonfiction storytelling for nonprofits and museums. I also taught filmmaking at George Mason University in Virginia for about 2 years. And 2020 is actually my first time voting.
Wow. Well, we're going to talk about that and more. So would love to kind of jump into the movie, the documentary. And I'm excited because actually you're the first filmmaker on the podcast that I have. So what was the impetus behind this film? Why did you decide to take on this project?
Yeah, so one of the reasons is I was becoming a first-time voter myself. So at the time, back in late 2016 and early 2017, when I started working on the project, I was interested in exploring voting and democratic participation from voters in my own community and on both sides. I was particularly interested in first-time voters living in swing states.
Great. So, and how has this experience been like compared to some of the other projects that you've done in past?
Yeah, so this is my first feature-length documentary, and I've done commissioned projects, but I think in terms of comparison, I would probably compare it to my last independent documentary, which was a half-hour documentary called Chinatown. So that film follows 3 Chinatown residents in DC and their activism to keep their building affordable in Chinatown because of gentrification. The building owner wanted to sell the building. So that was the story. And and I wanted to compare it to that project because they're both what I call independent project, meaning that I am responsible for getting the project funded, essentially. So First Vote is very different because for Chinatown, the story happened in the same city that I live. So in terms of filming, when the characters would just call me and tell me something is going on, I can go there in 30 minutes and film. So for First Vote, it's very different in that sense that the characters living North Carolina and Ohio. So it takes more planning in terms of production, and it involves a lot more traveling as well. And the film is also different because some of the characters, they go to political conventions and events. So in terms of getting access to those political events was something new to me that I had to navigate. And yeah, I mean, it's also a longer film, so requires more more fundraising, and distribution is also a little bit different as well.
That's great. And then what's the response been like from first vote? And what are some things that have happened that maybe you or the team didn't expect?
Yeah, so the response has been really amazing and rewarding. So audience members have told me that the film has energized them to stay hopeful and civically engaged, and inspire them to ask questions on of those whose beliefs are different from them. And some of them told me that they watched the film with their family members that have different political views. In terms of what we didn't expect, I would say the biggest thing is the pandemic, because we were finishing the film. We picture locked early this year, and we were finishing the film in. So I worked with a composer in February and finished that in March. And in March and April, I was supposed to go to New York to do color and sound, but because of the pandemic, I couldn't do that. So we had to figure out how to finish the film remotely, basically, working with people in New York. And distribution too. Distribution was impacted as well. Festivals weren't sure if they were going to cancel or if they were going to go virtual, and this was something new that nobody had ever done before. So the whole industry was, really trying to figure out how to respond. So yeah, so all of the festivals, the film premiered in May, and so all of the festivals have been virtual, and everything has been virtual so far.
Yeah. And what do you feel has been the impact of things being virtual? As you know, that the pandemic, of course, nobody can anticipate. And yeah, what are some of the good things that have come out of that?
The good things. So virtual certainly makes it harder to interact with audience or see audience and hear from them directly. However, on the other hand, virtual has really opened up in terms of accessibility to audience outside certain geographic locations where a festival might be, because it used to be that you have to be physically there to attend a film festival, but now because everything is virtual, and unless a festival geo block, otherwise usually they're available to audience in the United States. So no matter where you are, you can watch the film from your home, on your computer, on your TV. So I know one of the festivals, they had attendees from 27 different states. And then we also have community panels that we had audience from all over the country watching.
That's amazing. And I do want to do a plug, I guess. If someone's just listening right now and they're just super excited, how can they go and check out the film?
Yeah, so the film is right now streaming on worldchannel.org. It's part of the America Reframe series, and will be streaming till November 19th. And the film also just opened in AFI Silver Theater, virtual screening room, available in United States and its territories. So if you want to support a nonprofit theater, you can also watch it through AFI Silver Theater. And
yeah, I've actually seen it through the World Channel. So if you're listening right now, click on the link in the podcast description and go check it out as well. And go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add? The film will also play at the Hawaii International Film Festival. And for your audience in Canada, it will play at the Vancouver Asian Film Festival as well. And that's available to a Canadian audience.
That's amazing. And I love how the whole virtual aspects and people are able to watch this now in multiple countries and the accessibility. Um, Diving a little bit deeper into the movie itself, when I watched it, I felt the tone was fairly neutral. Was that intentional? You could just call me wrong. And what did the team do? What did the team do in the creation process to keep it that way?
Yeah, it was intentional because for me, and it's just not with this film, it's with my own film. As a filmmaker, it's my intention that I don't want to tell audience what to think. It's not an advocacy film. Um, so I really want to leave space for audience to think for themselves and decide for themselves. And this is a very complex story. It explores many complex issues. And I also want to add nuance and humanize political perspective. So I certainly don't want to tell audience what to think. So that was my intention. And in terms of how we did it in the creation process, I was really thinking more about from a storytelling perspective. For me, it's always story first versus issue first. So I was thinking about things like how can each scene moves the story forward, and how can I keep audience engaged and keep them interested in watching, and how can this scene or this moment reveal something new about the characters and something about the characters that we for us to know who that person is, and also in the editing process thinking about how can we create a story arc. So there is a beginning, middle, and end, and there is a story development. And I also always think about setup and payoffs, that that audience would feel that makes audience feel rewarding watching the movie when there's setup and payoffs, right? So these are the things that I tend to think about more when I'm editing. And I would say one thing that really helped was one of the editors, he actually started a Trello storyboard. So the whole editing was also remote. I was in DC and I worked with two editors. One of them, he lives in New York, and the other editor, she's in San Francisco. So we had a storyboard through this software called Trello. And it's a very visual storyboard that we had screenshots, and we laid out the structure, act 1, act 2, act 3, what are the scenes. So that really helped with the editing process.
And then during the editing, were there like some scenes that you were like, oh my God, I really want to include this one? But I know it sort of packed a punch within the hour that I saw. So it must have been a tough process to edit.
Yeah, I filmed a lot of footage. I filmed like hundreds of hours of footage. The production took about 2 years, and I had 4 characters, and I usually spend about a week with them each time. And so I film constantly because this is an observational style film. I'm following real life, and I don't know what will happen the next moment. I don't want to miss anything. So I tend to film as much as I could. But of course, sometimes, I turn off camera, when I eat with the characters, and I talk with them when there's like an hour long car drive. But but yeah, there was a lot of footage, and there were a lot of interesting secondary characters that I interviewed that just didn't end up in the film. But I did edit some of the footage into very short clips, and they're available on the website. If you go to firstvotefilm.com under resources, there are short clips that you can watch, and also for the educational component of the film that teachers can also use in classrooms.
Great. Again, if you're listening, go to firstvotefilm.com to check it out. So getting a little bit into the movie itself, and as I started watching it, so there are some facts that stood out to me. So and I didn't know some of these things, so these were eye-opening. So until one of them was, until 1952, federal law barred immigrants of Asian descent from becoming U.S. citizens and voting. Today, Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in U.S. More than 11 million Asian Americans will be able to vote in 2020. And so I was just surprised to learn these things. And what significance does this carry for the documentary?
Yeah, so I was doing research for the film, and when I came across these numbers, I was also very surprised myself when I learned that Asian Americans didn't have voting rights until 1952, which is actually quite recent. So I wanted to include it in the documentary to show that we can't take our voting rights for granted, and also some of the themes that I was exploring in the film, like immigration, voting rights, and also in terms of racial justice. I also found that there is connections between all of them. For example, immigration laws, how immigration laws can shape the demographics of this country. Before 1965, there's a racial quota for Asian Americans in terms of becoming citizens. And if it wasn't because of the immigration law of 1965, Jennifer's family wouldn't have been able to actually immigrate to the United States. So I saw a lot of connections between these different themes. And in terms of voting rights, in North Carolina during the 2018 midterms, there was a voter ID amendment on the ballot. And Kaiser talked about the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court case that basically got rid of part of the Voting Rights Act, which required a federal election, or any change to federal election law required clearance from Department of Justice. But that Supreme Court case got rid of that requirement. So each state, for example, the voting ID law was something before that they couldn't do on their own, but since Shelby and Holder, a lot of states started to have very strict voter ID state laws, right? So all these connections just started to merge, and even though the scene of Kaiser talking about that Supreme Court case, it's not in the film, but all these themes start to emerge, and so I felt it was important to include these larger contexts for us to understand the present situation.
And then, we started talking about some of the characters as well. And what was the process like for choosing some of the characters?
Yeah, it took me about 5 months to find the characters. So I started out was looking for first-time voters, Chinese American voters living in swing states on both sides. So I just started I actually didn't know, as you know, two of the characters in the film, they're members of Chinese Americans for Trump movement. So all my friends I know in DC, they are Asian Americans on the Democrat side. So I didn't know anyone from that movement. So I started out asking people I know around me. I told them what I was looking for, and do you know anybody who is part of that movement? And surprisingly to me, actually, if I never asked, I would never know. Actually, some of them do know someone, so they told me, "Oh, you can talk to this person." So I talked to a lot of people and told them about the film, but most of them didn't. They talked to me on the phone. They were very frank about. I interviewed them on the phone, but they weren't willing to be part of a documentary that I would follow them for almost 2 years until the 2018 midterms. So so then in that process, I heard multiple people telling me, and these are Chinese American voters living in Virginia, that they listen to this podcast. This guy in Ohio has this Mandarin language podcast, kind of like Rush Limbaugh, very conservative podcast that they listen to on a Chinese social media app, WeChat. So I looked him up, and I emailed him, and then I talked to him on the phone. I told him I asked if I could go to Ohio and film him doing a podcast, and he said yes. And similar with Sue. People told me, "Oh, you should look up this woman who ran for Congress in 2016 in North Carolina." She ran. It was her first time running for office. She's a real estate business person, and so she won the Republican primary, but she lost in the general election. And her district happens to be the same district where Kaiser and Jennifer live. So fourth district of North Carolina.
It's interesting you mentioned, how you're going beyond your own social circles, but even within the social circle, there are people that knew that started helping you out in finding some of these connections. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting how Lance, his podcast actually reached people way outside Ohio, because I remember the first day after I filmed with him, he put me on the spot. He was like, "Oh, do you want to?" And he was doing his podcast, right? And I was recording. And then at the end, he was like, "Oh, by the way, I have this director here filming, and let's ask her to say something." So I was totally unprepared, and I didn't know what to say. And he put me on the spot. He wanted me to say something on his podcast. So I don't even remember what I said.
And then
I wish, and then actually the people who told me about him actually heard the podcast on the same day, and they messaged me on WeChat, and they said, "Oh, we heard you. You're in Ohio."
And I mean, I think these connections you're making, and they're correct. The characters, are in different places and have different views. And was there ever talk of like them meeting together or having a meal together, or maybe that's
Pre-pandemic, they really would have, particularly with festival premiere. I would probably have invited all of them to the festival premiere, but this film premiered after the pandemic, so everything has been virtual. And actually, a few weeks ago, University of Colorado Boulder hosted a panel discussion with all four of the characters. So that was the first time all four of them met each other virtually, and they were on the same panel.
What was that like for together?
Well, I was quite nervous, to be honest, before the panel because it was the first time, and they all feel very. I know they all feel very strongly in terms of their own views. So I wasn't sure what it would look like, but it actually went well, and the moderator had really great questions for everybody. So yeah, so for anyone who is interested, this is the first one and that we've done, probably the only one, the only one we've done with all four characters. So if anybody's interested, the recording is actually available, and if you go to firstofallfilm.com and go to screenings, find the screening at University of Colorado Boulder, and then you'll see there's a link to the recording for the panel.
Awesome. I'll be sure to include a link to that in the podcast description as well to make it easy. Kind of want to jump a little bit into some of the moments that were in the documentary that stood out to me, at least. There was a scene where, Jennifer Ho, she talks about, people don't know who Asian Americans are. Also, she's saying, how we can't find a common ground. And, for her, I'm seeing her husband, who's presumably white, is sitting right next to her. And, he's just silently listening. And so what was the significance of having her husband there in this scene there?
Yeah, so I remember Jennifer said people who don't know Asian Americans was right after her class, after she taught Asian Americans in the South class, and she was walking outside the classroom and like walking on campus. She said that. The scene with the husband was. I filmed that at outside their house on the porch. So her husband was there because I wanted to interview them together. So that's why I had both of them there. And it was a very long interview. I interviewed them for about probably an hour. So we talked about a lot of things. And I really didn't think about the importance of having her husband there. The intention was really to interview them together. And it just so happens that in the editing, in terms of the story, that was part of the interview that ended up in the final film. And it just so happens that it was Jennifer talking, and her husband was there, and he didn't really say anything. So it was just part of a very long interview I did with both of them, and it was very early morning, and Jennifer was very energetic. She's definitely a morning person. I was still waking up, and she had been up for like 2 hours already. She already walked her dog and everything, and so she was very energetic. But her husband just had his coffee, and I think he was still waking up like me. So yeah.
It's kind of fun learning these little quirks, and I think and then there's another scene that comes to mind, which is, there's an emotional, and she's almost like a crying protester who says, she's just frustrated that her parents will vote for Trump. And she thinks it's because they watch Fox News. And, what role does media play in influencing the opinions of the characters? Or I just didn't see as much discussion about media, or was there a particular reason why?
Well, I actually did. Somehow you were. Can you repeat the question? Yeah, you were cut out for like most part of the question.
Thank you. I'll just repeat it. So in one of the scenes, there is an emotional protester, and she's just frustrated that her parents will vote for Trump, and she thinks it's because they watch Fox News. So what role does media play in influencing the opinions of some of the characters? Or I just didn't see as much discussion of media. And was there a reason why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, your first question. So, when I was actually filming with Sue, actually, the day, if you remember that scene, the North Carolina Republican convention, that was actually the day Trump announced that he decided to withdraw from Paris Climate Accord. So that's why there were protesters outside, and they were protesting that, mostly that and other things. Um, and it's interesting because after the convention, I went home with Sue, and she started watching Fox News coverage, and so yeah, I mean, she does, and I filmed that, and I did an interview with her while she was watching TV, um, about her thoughts on uh, 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 withdrawing from leaving the Paris Climate Accord. And if you remember the scene where Lance was in the car and driving to the Ohio Republican convention with Trump, right? He was in the car and he was listening to the radio, and the radio announced that the president was coming to Ohio that day. So I asked him what he was listening to, and it's actually Fox Business. So I did film these moments where, they were listening or watching media. And at one point of one of the rough cuts stage, I did include, I actually wanted to include a lot more. I feel like rough cuts were more issue driven. It was me, kind of like going down different issues. Oh, media, let's show this, and different issues, let's show. So it was in the cut at some point. But those are not, again, going back to my approach in terms of story first. I really wanted the film to be engaging, and that was one of the most important things to me. So that means, there are certain scenes that maybe touches on different issues, but they're not necessarily the most interesting or engaging scenes, right? So, it's a decision that I really had to make, what to keep in the film and what not. So it just turns out that those scenes didn't end up in the film. And I wish, but that's the other thing, right? Like for an article, I feel like if someone were to write an article, they can really go down the list and talk about each issue, right? But with documentaries, there is a limitation of what footage can we get. And particularly for this film, it's not an interview driven film. And it really is capturing moments from real life and seeing seeing the characters doing something. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I feel like documentaries it's just not. This film is not going to cover everything.
And again, if you're listening right now, go check it out at firstvotefilm.com. I think, it's interesting how much content there is that is not in the 1 hour. It makes me almost want to see if there's going to be a second version, like a follow up or something. And I mean, I think another um, fact that I stood out to me as I was watching it is towards the end, which says, Asian Americans or immigrants are projected to become the largest immigrant group in U.S. by 2055, and I've been sharing that with many friends now since I saw that. But playing that out, sort of, okay, well, what takes place in documentary, but also now kind of moving forward to 2055. What kinds of changes do you see happening?
Yeah, so I was recently on the panel with the chair of CAPAC, the Congressional APA caucus representative, Congresswoman Judy Chu, and I really love what she said, that Asian Americans have gone from being marginalized to being margin of victory. I really love what that quote from her. And so Asian Americans didn't, in terms of the changes, Asian Americans didn't have voting rights until 1952, but we're now the fastest growing segment of eligible voters in the United States, and more than 11 million will be able to vote this year. Particularly, Asian Americans are swing voting a growing number of key swing districts. So as you see in the film, that and the number is changing too. So the number in the film you see is 5% or more Asian American voters are margin of victory in 79 counties and 102 congressional districts. And 2018 was the year that a record number of AAPI representatives were elected in Congress. And on that panel, North Carolina Asian Americans Together, which is a civic engagement organization in North Carolina, and the executive producer was on that, executive director, she was also on that panel, and she said that Asian Americans have requested 9 times the amount of mail-in ballots this year. That was weeks ago too, 9 times than 2016. So I think that we're really seeing a more growing number of Asian American voters, and hopefully a higher voter turnout this year.
That's great. And then it feels like we're sort of living in the change as it's happening now, as your conversations are starting to describe that. As we're sort of wrapping up here, can you share any specific events or anything you'd like the podcast audience to go check it out?
I would love your podcast audience to watch the film. It's streaming at worldchannel.org. It's part of the America Reframed series, and it's streaming until November 19th. It's also playing at AFI Silver Theater virtual screening room. So if you want to support a great nonprofit theater, which is actually in my hometown, DC, Maryland area. One of my favorite nonprofit theater, AFI Silver. And the film will also play at the Hawaii International Film Festival in November. And for audience in Canada, the film will screen at the Vancouver Asian Film Festival. And follow us on social media, First Vote Film, and visit our website, firstvotefilm.com. We have recordings from previous panels, and we also have resources available on our website as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for being on the show. And again, if you're listening, go check out firstvotefilm.com and check out the movie. Thanks again, Yi.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. Please hit the subscribe button. We'll be back next week.